Okay, so I'm just going to tell everyone about what the format's going to be here so that you know what to expect. So we have Richard for an hour, of which we are very grateful for, Richard. And what we're hoping to do is I have some questions to pose for Richard, but we're having a sort of discussion, a conversation about various topics, including the state of the economy, what's going on politically, what Richard thinks about the NHS and its funding and things like that, which we're very interested in, obviously, because it's our area of interest. We're going to have a Q&A session for about 10 or 15 minutes at the end. So if you've got questions that pop into your brain when we're going along, please pop them into the chat box at the bottom here, and we will come to them at the end because we're very keen that you should have that opportunity. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things before we get going. To anyone who doesn't subscribe yet to Richard's blog, we have a link to it in the chat down here. It's excellent, and I'm constantly having people sending me links to your blog, which is brilliant. We're also, Etta, would you mind popping the links for us down at the bottom as well? I'm only mentioning these guys because we've just launched some new merchandise in our shop, and it's selling out very fast. So if you wanted one of our new summer bags, they're going really fast. And also, we're running a crowdfund at the moment to keep our work going because we think that outreach is very, very important at the moment, and we're hoping to turn what we do into a movement. So if anyone hasn't donated and would like to, please click on the link. Right, without further ado, first thing I'd like to talk to you about, Richard, has nothing to do with the economy, and it's about YouTube. And the reason I'm curious about it is because for anyone who doesn't know and isn't on YouTube, Richard has developed a very large following of people who avidly listen to what you're saying. And I'm curious about it, Richard, because you and I first came across each other a few years back now on Twitter. And Twitter has a certain conversational style, shall we say, which is quite kind of debate-like. There's obviously a lot of people on there who are very knowledgeable about politics, and it certainly felt 4 or 5 years ago like you could do effective campaigning work on Twitter because there was a large body of people there who were very interested in politics, and the journalists were there and the politicians were there and stuff. I left Twitter in the end because I felt like it was no longer a place effectively see each other and have a conversation. And I'm not doing very much on YouTube, but you are. And what I'm curious about, Richard, and I wonder if other people would like to know this as well, is who are you talking to on YouTube, and how do you see the conversation changing as we've got a new government? What are people saying on YouTube, and what are they wanting to hear from you?
I started doing YouTube during lockdown, and I worked with a guy called Mark Cooney. And Mark unfortunately died during the COVID era, but not of COVID, of cancer. And that was I felt a great loss because Mark was only 51. And I then lost my way with YouTube at that point. A year ago, just over a year ago, I was going to launch the Taxing Wealth report. My younger son was a bit of a loose end. He had graduated. I thought he was going to be a chef and realized that wasn't going to be a chef. It's not an obvious route for an accounting and finance degree, but that's what he thought he was going to do. Because accounting and finance had definitely put him off doing anything else. And, knowing that he was a photographic geek, which I won't put anything against him for that. I'm a geek as well. I said to him, look, do you want to try this again? Shall we try it? And we'll do 3 months and see what happens. Well, it grew slowly at first. There's a story that you have to put out your first 100 YouTube videos before you actually make one which is okay. And I think there's a very strong element of truth in that. Please don't look at what we put out a year ago. And it wasn't until about October last year that suddenly everything began to explode. And Donald Trump was a major contributor to our success on YouTube. He attracted a big audience. We have an audience which is about 35 to 40%, depending on the day in the UK. US is normally our second largest audience, then Canada and Australia come in strongly. So we have a worldwide audience. And if I look at more general economic questions, then that can go all over the world. Obviously, today's was very much about, we did one today on reform and green policy and why they're trying to put up energy prices, basically. Well, that's obviously incredibly UK focused, and the traffic is lower. I'm quite happy to do that. If I think it's the right thing to do, I'll put out a video whether it's going to have a big or a small traffic. All our biggest ones have been on Trump. I seem to be incredibly popular on East Coast America for some reason. I think they like a guy with a British sounding accent slagging off Trump. It seems to go down incredibly well. British sounding accent, Irish passport, but there we go. That's the paradox. Who am I talking to? I'm talking again to people who are wanting to understand the issue, who may well not be professional accountants, lawyers, economists, anything in the area. And so I'm presuming no prior knowledge. That's absolutely critical when I turn on the microphone. I started off doing absolutely unscripted. I have to say I now do quite a lot of preparation. I'm still wearing foundation at the moment because we were recording this afternoon and I don't think I've taken it off. I never knew that at the age of 67 I'd learned how to wear foundation. I've never done it before, but now I have to. There are in fact 5 studio lights around me at the moment. This is the studio. And so we've invested a lot to try to put it right. It's been an immensely enjoyable experience. We've had 5.8 million views on YouTube in the last month, but over 200,000 a day. A month is 28 days by the way, in YouTube terms. It pays for itself, which is very interesting. I can pay my son now a decent salary for somebody who is a couple of years out of university, a fair training, but plus salary. Well above minimum wage. I'm now actually thinking of recruiting somebody else because we're doing so much work and people are asking us to do more. It's exciting. I mean, there's a massive dopamine hit when one goes. I can't pretend otherwise. I mean, the statistics are fantastic. But why do we do it? It's all about communication. It's all about discussing fundamentally relationships of power and how they impact the allocation of resources in society. Yeah. So the NHS is obviously part of that. How do we balance up the relationships of power to make sure we have a fair supply of services? And as I said before we started, I always have this bias to the poor in it, but it's working, it seems.
Can I
just say one thing?
Of course, yeah.
The audience is incredibly biased in our case. First of all, it's aged over 50, which I think has something to do with this colour hair. And it's 80+% male.
Wow, that's interesting.
Which is, in a sense, that's the topic. I remember when I started as a campaigner, we used to try desperately hard to have balanced gender panels at events, and we couldn't even get a woman to come, let alone a balanced gender panel for every panel on a conference or something. It was really hard. These topics do not attract enough women. It's really quite embarrassing that everything around this issue. But there is an appetite for explanation of what is going on, is what I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when we started Every Doctor, we got accused of some people of being too female centric. I had a phone call with one doctor who was a bloke. He was a very nice man, but he said, Julia, this is just turning into like a ladies club. And I don't know why he got that impression because like you say, on the whole, my experience is that it's often men who are interested in talking about politics, but I think having a female at the helm to some men makes it look like a ladies' lunch, even if it's not.
Well, the other thing you would actually see, I mean, my blog gets up to a couple of hundred comments a day. And on average is read 30,000 times a day now. So that's a good comment ratio. It doesn't look as though there are many women commenting on the blog. Actually, there are many more women commenting than you think, but they use either a pseudonym or they use initials or whatever else. So there's actually quite a lot of women now. That is a very welcome change because 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. I've been doing the blog for 19 years. I'm an overnight sensation after 19 years on YouTube, so I've got practice at doing this. But it is good to see there that a lot more women are willing to come out into the open on social media or are at least commenting, which is something that didn't happen. YouTube is a very friendly channel. Can I also mention that? It's very friendly. I was expecting a pile on and loads of abuse. Our average like rate is around 98%. And around 10% of people who watch our videos do actually hit a like or dislike button.
Wow. That's cool.
And the comments tend to be incredibly informed. Obviously, there's a lot of, there are bots, particularly on ours because it's finance. And so people try to promote their brokers, which is all the biggest load of rubbish on earth and everything. And I try and go through and delete the worst of those. But I don't have time to do them all. But it is surprisingly positive,
Friendly,
compared to my experience at Twitter, for example, which was quite abusive.
I find the same on TikTok now, and it shocks me actually. You'll get the odd unpleasant thing, but most of it's fine. Okay, so this leads us on to, I suppose, the first big question that I would like to ask Richard, which is, how is the economy actually going in the UK at the moment? What's your summary of what's actually happening? Because I think a lot of us are hearing the hearsay and a lot of alarming stuff, maybe about what's currently happening or what's coming down the track. And it would be lovely to hear from you what you think the state of it is right now.
Well, I'm glad you say you think it's going to be lovely, because let me put it like this. Enjoy it while it lasts, because it's going to get worse. That's my prognosis. We are in a situation where we've had 5 years of near enough stagnation. Very little has happened of any real consequence over those 5 years, if you look at the conventional models of economic success. So growth is incredibly modest. Growth per head is lower, and the government therefore ignores growth per head, which is actually what, of course, really matters to people. There is much worse employment situation than the government claims, partly because the Office for National Statistics has lost control of the employment data. People now don't fill in forms and send them back to the ONS, which they used to. So the unemployment figures are absolutely hopelessly inaccurate. I do believe there's a lot of disguise unemployment in the economy. People, for example, doing lots of self-employments, which are frankly just to get them off benefits, because that's the easiest way to actually claim something without actually being hassled to apply for jobs for 35 hours a week, but very little income being generated. There is no sign of economic confidence. The consumer confidence indexes are at, in this country and others, not just here, but in the US and in some parts of continental Europe, are at record low levels, the sorts of level that we have only seen vaguely in major recessions, 2008, going back even sort of to the mid-70s, and I'm old enough to remember the mid-70s, where confidence levels did sometimes hit very low levels. Now they're doing it again. There is no indication of serious business investment because of the enormous amount of uncertainty in the world. Tariffs are disrupting supply chains. They don't know where to place investment, how to place investment, what to do with investment. And I happen to think the business is also at a terrible state. It's run out of ideas. There's nothing it's innovating. There's no new sign of anything, which is terribly important. AI is useful, but it's not going to change the world in the way the washing machine did, or in the way that the mobile phone did, or the way that the internet itself did. I mean, it's good stuff. I use AI on occasions, including when we make videos. It's freaky that AI can actually make me sound like me, because we can actually edit duff words out without having to re-record. And that's useful. But it's not so far in many places really providing the boost that people think. And of course, it also threatens unemployment. And we have utterly illiterate, economically illiterate government policies going on.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So I'd love to hear what you think about kind of current policy. But when we were coming on the way into the election, and Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were coming out with these stock phrases about, we're going for growth, and growth is the only thing we care about. And they were courting businesses and going to all those breakfasts in the city and all that sort of stuff. Richard, do you think there was any legitimacy to the things that they were saying about their ability to create growth? Or do you think it was being done as a way to, convince the public about something that was never going to happen?
Look, I haven't been close to the Labour Party for a while. Everybody thinks that I was close to Jeremy Corbyn, and I do know Jeremy Corbyn, and I did write a lot of his economic policy, or rather he nicked the policy from me and used it. I don't care which way round it was. I write policy, people want to borrow it, they can. In fact, most of what he nicked was actually written for Caroline Lucas and the Green Party. But he used it, and that was fine. I did know Rachel Reeves for a while. I had visited her office. There was no economic substance to what Rachel was doing then, and I don't think there is now. And I think what we've learned since is that the only thing that Labour knew about was how to A, get rid of the left, and B, win an election, but C, had absolutely no idea what it was going to do with it. And that's become horribly apparent since then. Rachel Reeves is an extremely conventional Oxford-taught PPE economist. Remember, the PPE degree is a 3-year degree, of which only 1 year, therefore net, is in economics. It is really rather basic. It's rather like doing, the first year and never doing anything else in economics or whatever else. So it's not a great basis, and it doesn't tend to go into depth, and it doesn't tend to lead to questioning of models. She then worked for various banks, probably not with the degree of status that she would like to claim. I think her CV is very much open to question. She was not a policymaker. She went into Parliament. It doesn't appear she knows how to make policy. There is a complete... she acts in awe of the Bank of England. The Bank of England is a problem. I do not think the Bank of England should be independent. I say that time and again. Its interest rate policy is dire for the UK. We have an interest rate which is still something like 1.5% at least too high for what we really need. It should be around inflation rate or slightly less if we're going to have any chance of growth, but it's therefore killing it. It's obviously making household economics very hard for the people who have mortgages. I've reached that nice stage in life where actually I haven't. But I can have a lot of sympathy with everybody who has, because I remember that part of life. This is really bad news. The whole strategy of the government, again, with regard to what we're seeing in the NHS, is economically illiterate. You are going for growth and you're sacking people.
Yes,
you are going to be reorganizing, but you sack the previous boss and all the staff who might deliver your plan before you've got a new plan.
Yes.
There is absolutely no capacity here to think in a way that is coordinated, as far as I can see. And this came out in the migration policy this week. There is a new video tomorrow morning on migration policy, which will not make me popular with Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage or Kemi Badenoch, come to that. And I really don't care about that, because I actually really do think we need migrants in this country. I was deeply offended by Starmer's speech. I come from a family of economic migrants. I mean, that is why my Irish family, and I'm married to an Irish woman, and I have a very large extended Irish family, and I consider we're all economic migrants squatting in the UK. And I was deeply offended. I look very white. I sound very English. I was brought up here, but nonetheless from an Irish migrant family. And I'm deeply offended by this, and it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to have a policy of this sort when we have a low birth rate, 1.4 per woman of childbearing age, when we need 2.1 to replace the population, and we have a dependency ratio, the ratio of the number of people who are in work to the number of people who are actually dependent upon them in old age, which, technically I now fall into that capacity, even though I'm still working, or that group. But that's 30 now and rising to 35 at least fairly quickly. None of these things seem to have been thought about.
No, I agree.
And that scares me rigid, that they don't have this ability to join up anything in a coherent sense. And they have this absolutely naive belief in neoliberal economics. One of the characteristics of neoliberal economics is that when you say something, it happens. They confuse the memo with delivery, which is quite extraordinary. If they say we are going to change something, they believe the market will react instantly and everything will happen. I can only guess it means that they've never really worked, most of them, in the real world, because actually I've written memos in relatively small organizations and discovered that actually nothing happens because other people knew better than me how the organization worked, and I got the wrong end of the stick, seriously, as a manager. But they're doing it with the country and they don't understand this.
No. So I thought maybe I'll just pause for 1 second and just update anyone who isn't aware of all of the stuff they're doing to the NHS at the moment. I'll explain. And then what I would like, Richard, possibly, is if you could explain why it doesn't make sense in terms of the funding and why they need to do things differently. So there's a confusing set of things that have happened with this government, confusing to anyone who is expecting them to do the right stuff for the NHS anyway. After they came into power last October, they made a lot of noise about setting up a public consultation for the NHS because they said they wanted to write a 10-year plan going forward of all the brilliant things they were going to do. So they've probably spent a huge amount of taxpayers' money on running this thing that they're calling Change NHS. They say that they've had over 250,000 submissions to this thing. They ran all these events all over the country. Richard, do you want to say something about that?
No, I'm actually reading the chat whilst I'm listening to you. Sorry, I'm
no, that's fine. So that's been going on while this consultation has been going on, and they've been putting up, videos on the website that all look brilliant, and it looks very, like they're involving everybody and it's all very welcoming. They have actually been making lots of changes to the NHS in the intervening period. We haven't yet had the outcome either of the consultation they've been running or the plan that they say they've been putting together. But in the meantime, as you probably know, they've announced they're abolishing NHS England, which is a massive organisation that does a lot of the kind of management of things in the NHS in England. It is an enormous, sprawling organisation, partly because politicians have made the NHS itself so sprawling. So NHS England has become this overcomplicated thing. But it does do a lot of essential tasks. And if they get rid of it, they're going to have to get someone else to do a lot of that work. They've also recently announced a whole bunch of funding cuts at various levels. So it looks like in total across NHS England, the Department of Health and Social Care, integrated care boards, which are like the regional boards, there's 42 of them in England, and local trusts, that we're going to lose over 20,000 staff, which is a massive cut. And I'm just going to read something out from a BBC article that came out maybe about a week ago now about some of the cuts that are having to be made. What has happened is that at NHS England, which they are abolishing, a lot of the leadership apparently resigned. I suspect it's more that they left when they didn't, go along with plans that were presented to them. But either way, they're gone. They've got a new bloke who's in charge. He is apparently well thought of. I have heard good things about him, but from what I can see, he's doing what the government would like him to do. And he's essentially told NHS trusts that they have to save a lot of money because otherwise they're going to go into deficit. So essentially they're going to go into more debt. So he's telling NHS trusts in England, I think the figure is 6.5 billion they need to save in the next year. So I'm going to read out just something from the BBC website. So it says, services including diabetes care for young people, rehab centres and talking therapies are in the firing line, according to NHS providers, and also staff. So doctors and nurses face losing their jobs. And I just wanted to pause for 1 second, Richard, before hearing what you have to think about this, because there was a lot of noise made after the autumn budget statement came out in October about the enormous amount of money they were giving to the NHS, which was £22.6 billion. And it was a bit more than they previously had done. But from what I could see, it probably wasn't enough. Anyway, they're now making these cuts. So from where I'm standing, it looks like they're giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And I'm concerned about that. But what I would like to hear about, Richard, from you is there any basis in their line that they keep trotting out that there's no more money for the NHS? And if not, what could they be doing differently to get that money together?
First of all, let's deal with the question, and it's been raised in the chat already, and I'm going to therefore deal with this. Is there money for the NHS? Yes. Government is not funded by taxation. Government is funded by money creation. Every single penny that has been spent by the UK government since 1866 has been created by the Bank of England on behalf of the government through something called the Consolidated Fund. Sometimes through another rather archaic sounding name, the Ways and Means account, which was the overdraft facility, whereas the Consolidated Fund is the sort of capital account. But whichever way you look at it, the government is actually funded by money creation. If the government passes a bill in Parliament and says, we have a budget, and out of that budget, it tells the Bank of England it wants to spend, then there is a person called the Auditor General who has the duty to check that it has been authorised. And so long as it's been authorised by the budget, the Bank of England must pay it. And it doesn't require there to be money in a bank account at the Bank of England. So unlike us, there is no such thing as an overdraft limit. There is no way in which the Bank of England can say no to us. They won't send us a letter saying your overdraft has reached its limit. You can't max out the credit card. You don't have to pay interest from the government to the Bank of England if you are overdrawn. They can create as much money as they like, because one of the definitions of the nation state is the capacity to create legal tender. In fact, it is one of the fundamental definitions of the nation state, is this capacity to create something called legal tender and call it money and require that it be used by then forcing people to pay it back to you in the form of taxation.
I want to take a moment for those that are interested in the Scottish perspective of what Richard has just said here. And it is important for those Scots and honorary Scots who are interested in seeing the resumption of full self-determination in Scotland to take note of the history of what we've lost and what was our rights. Now, he says, one of the definitions of the nation state is the capacity to create legal tender. One of the fundamental definitions of the nation state is this capacity to create something called legal tender and call it money. Now we have from the Dublin Weekly Nation for Saturday the 23rd of July 1853, published in the Treaty of Union Articles 2019 in the chapter Scotland wasn't conquered, ceded or occupied by England. It stated, "Here are the provisions of the treaty which were designed to preserve the self-control of the Scottish nation from the centralising propensities of England, one of which is, by the 16th article, it is provided that the coin shall be continued in Scotland under the same rules as the mint in England." From the Dundee People's Journal for Saturday the 5th of April 1884, from the same publication, chapter entitled Articles 1875 to 1900, it asks, "Where are the rights and privileges conferred upon us by the Treaty of Union? It seems to me that they have taken wings and flown away. Where is our national mint?" From the Cork Examiner for Monday the 25th of July 1853, from the same publication, chapter entitled Formation of the National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, it states, "In violation of the Treaty of Union, our Court of Exchequer, Court of Admiralty, and Mint have been abolished, and our arms degraded." From the more recent publication, published I think in the 1970s, entitled Scotland's Scrap of Paper, it states, "Scottish nationalists should familiarise themselves with the different ways in which the Treaty of Union with England of 1707 has been broken. They should demand a separate mint, coinage, and postage stamps for Scotland. We shouldn't need to demand these things. These things were conferred upon us by right of the Treaty of Union. They were secured to us. We were to keep our mint. We were to keep our post office. We no longer have those assets, and Anglo-centralisation has a lot to answer for with the myriad negative impacts it's had on Scotland since the Union."
Now, taxation only exists fundamentally at its core to recover the money the government has spent so that inflation does not result. It also at one time recovered the gold that the government had spent because there was a finite resource of gold. But that is deepest, darkest history. We haven't been on the gold standard or anything remotely like it since 1971, when I was at the grand old age of 14. Let's not go back there. It's history so irrelevant these days. So the government can create the money if it wants. This pretends that we're dependent upon taxpayers' money. There is no such thing as taxpayers' money. In fact, we use government money. They don't use our money because they make it.
What can you explain to us then, Richard? Why do they fixate on taxpayer money? What's the benefit to them ignoring the reality of the situation?
Because their political belief is neoliberal. Their belief is that markets are the solution to all problems. And the dogma of neoliberal capitalism, which is based upon in turn neoclassical thinking in economics, which broadly speaking emerged in the late 19th century, but heavily post 1945, and is a deeply mathematical model of the way in which the economy works, and which presumes that we're all deeply rational human beings who try to maximize our well-being by maximizing our consumption and wealth. All of that is based upon the idea that that is only possible if markets allocate resources, and government interference in the market creates imperfections, and the government should therefore not act. The NHS is therefore a giant imperfection as far as all these politicians are concerned, which is why Wes Streeting does really want to get rid of it, because he believes that it is a giant imperfection. And so does Rachel Reeves, so does Keir Starmer. And they are wrong. It is not a giant imperfection. It is actually the most efficient way to deliver. The model we have for the supply, so there is no actual constraint. There is a constraint of real physical resources. So if there are no doctors to hire, if there are no nurses to hire or phlebotomists to hire or receptionists to hire, because I am well aware that the NHS is not just frontline medical staff, and not necessarily even the highest grades of medical staff. We're dependent on an integrated team. If there are no such people to hire, you can't expand the NHS. Simple, straightforward statement of fact. Of course, this is where migration policy comes into it. The story that you're most likely to meet a migrant as the person treating you in the NHS is normally true, of course. It's absolutely right. We know that, as a matter of fact. But if we are actually looking at the constraint and calling it financial, this is nonsense. But the other nonsense factor is that when these people look at government spending, they presume that there is this black hole. This is the theory of right-wing think tanks. Everything the government spends goes into a black hole. So every doctor's salary is just wasted money. It's poured into there and there's no benefit from it. But actually, of course, that's not true. Government expenditure has what is called a multiplier effect. So for every pound that you spend on the NHS, you will get some money back. Some of it is actually tax paid by the people you pay it to. And some doctors are paying 45% tax probably. Therefore, they will be paying back quite a bit straight away, plus national insurance. Others obviously aren't paying that much. But the point is that the spend does create a social benefit. And the social benefit is not well measured. We are not good at doing double entry on social benefits. We should do, we need to, but we don't. And if you look at the social benefit of spending on the NHS, the multiplier effect is thought to be 3 or 4. In other words, for every pound you spend, you generate value of 3 or 4 pounds because you have got somebody well, you've got them back to work, you've got them off benefits, if you're doing well, you might cure someone, though I understand that's pretty rare, but at least you manage their condition, which I think is much more common. Although, of course, if you break a leg and you get that repaired, you've done a good job. If you take away a brain tumor and the person recovers, you've done a great job. You've got a cure in some cases, but otherwise you still manage your conditions so people can work. True also, of course, with mental health. You put people into a state where they can function. All of the benefits of that give rise to this massive multiplier effect. So when the government says there's no money, what they're saying is we don't want the multiplier effect, the benefits. And the benefits will, of course, be people at work who are paying tax. So, in fact, the NHS is one of the only resources where the government can spend money where it will collect more money back as a result of a pound spent than anything else it can do. Defence can't do this. Education does, but the lag is very long. Teach a toddler how to read just about at the age of 5, or a kid of 5, teach them how to read, and you won't see a benefit until they're 21, most likely, or whatever. But so there's a long lag there. But in the NHS, there is very little lag. So the return is enormous. And yet the government says it isn't there. They also have this inept way, which was designed by the Tories, of course, in the 80s and 90s of organising the NHS. There is no corporate model that looks anything like the NHS. If you look at a large company, it has a very strong head office that sets the tone in most cases. They run like Stalinist dictatorships with 5-year plans. They will send down to the organizations what you're going to do. There's very little devolved power. There's very standardized systems. There is a commonality of approach to save cost because they realize that if you've got to create a health and safety policy in one hospital, it will be pretty much the same health and safety policy in every hospital because that's the case. And yet we spend vast amounts of time and effort creating duplicate things. We have all of these trusts, every one of which has its own accounting team, not on the same systems, preparing its own annual report, its own chief executive, its own directors, all of that waste of resource, none of which is needed in the same way. You should actually, of course, also not have splits between hospital trusts and ambulance trusts and GP trusts and whatever else, and of course, mental health trusts, all of whom are cross-billing each other like fury all the time for services supplied, creating vast amounts of billing exercise exercises, all of which have to be reconciled. And as an accountant, I'll tell you that's a nightmare. Only it's probably very difficult to achieve. You would actually set them up as integrated units. The logical structure for the health service in the UK is to have an East Anglian health service and a Welsh health. Well, we've got a Welsh health service, thankfully. We've got a Scottish health service by and large, much better organised in very many ways than England. But we'd have a South West board in England, and we'd have a London one, and we'd have a South East, and whatever. And these would be integrated care units. And so you would actually have the ambulance trust not suffering the externality of the A&E unit not being able to accept people in because the cost would be shared.
Yes,
but it isn't. And we get these perverse incentives inside this absolutely ridiculous structure. My wife was always offended that people used to read her referrals when she was a GP to make sure she wasn't over referring to the hospital. She said, I never referred somebody unless I really had to. She never had one rejected, but people were doing this because there was a boundary where there was a charge made, and therefore they wanted to control the charge. Now, all of this is complete nonsense. We need to actually consolidate into proper healthcare structures, which are regional, which report to people on the integrated care service supplied. They should then be financially accountable. I don't think there's one health service for England. I think there can be in Wales. It's small enough. Scotland's pushing it with 5.5 million people and the geographic spread, in fairness. Yeah, the central belt in Scotland has a very different need from the north, for example. I know Scotland quite well. So I would be splitting it in different ways than that.
They are more organised though, aren't they?
They are. Yeah, there's a joined up service. There's a thinking which is different, which is really, really different. But we have to then understand, and we could then allocate resources to the value added. Instead, we're just measuring a financial performance. This idea of deficits is utterly bogus.
It's crazy.
It's only because you didn't give enough budget in the first place to meet the need for which demand arrived through A&E door or GP's door or wherever else. It isn't a real deficit.
And the deficit that doesn't, no, absolutely. And the deficit that doesn't get measured is the constant reform, is it? Either that politicians, all of this changing the structure and changing the organisations constantly, it has an enormous cost attached to it, doesn't it? Which never gets sort of quantified in any meaningful manner.
Well, we also don't measure the wear and tear on people who are trying to actually work in these conditions where they're always being told, you're going to have to deal with less.
Yes.
And there is nothing more disheartening than that.
Yes.
Be told all the time you've got to manage with less. I mean, I always look back to the time when I was chair of governors of a school in London in the 1990s. The total school budget in a year at that time was 750,000. This was a primary school. I was involved with several schools, but this one was a primary school. And I was told the repairs bill that I had to manage in the following year out of the budget was £900,000. And I said, well, I'll send all the kids home for a year and I'll still be running a deficit in the fourth term. Is that okay with you? Because that's the only way I can deal with this. Stupid management, which doesn't think about what it means. We have to actually have people who understand and integrate the thinking of health and finance together. But at the moment, we don't have that at all.
No. Something that I want to touch on that you mentioned a few minutes ago about Wes Streeting was that you said, do you say Wes Streeting wants to get rid of the NHS or wants to scrap it or something? I'll be interested to know about my theory about this, Richard, which I haven't actually told anyone about yet, but this is what I think has gone on. We've obviously got this short-term thinking election to election cycle with each of the different groups of politicians. And a lot of them, in my experience, aren't very knowledgeable about the NHS themselves. So they don't, if a minister tells them what to do, a lot of the backbenchers, in my experience, don't know how to push back anywhere against any of this stuff. However, a few years back, these integrated care boards got set up in 2022. And at the time, lots of us campaigners were speaking up and saying, this is a terrible plan. It's going to waste more money. It's just another reimagining of the same thing. But they're also managing to probably get private companies onto these boards, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff you're talking about, it wasn't a very efficient way to be organising things. But there was also this theory amongst some campaigners, which didn't become realised because the Tories lost power. But people thought that these regional boards had been set up as a precursor to handing various regions over to insurance companies because they thought that was the Tories' next natural step. And to anyone who's thinking, what are you talking about, Julia? In America, they will have regional areas which are sort of taken on by insurance companies. And there was this sort of loose idea that something similar would happen in England. Now, that plan never made it into reality. But with the new Labour government, my feeling is that they've scrapped these boards, or they're at least amalgamating a lot of them and cutting a lot of the costs, aren't they? At the moment, they're saying that they need to cut 50% of the costs. They don't like that Tory plan. They're saying on the surface that they want the NHS to be free to everybody and they want it to continue. And yet, in my opinion, they're privatising it in a different way, because all they're doing is keeping all of it looking the same with the logo on the front of everything, and they're just shelling it all out for profit. So they're just finding probably more effective ways than the Tories of handing enormous amounts of value to the private sector from the NHS while keeping the logo on the front so that the public think it's still there. Now, I don't know what you think about that, Richard, and we're obviously in the early stages if that is what they're going to do. But I've been very alarmed because they've entered into this massive deal with private companies. It's going to be seeing billions more going out to the private sector. That happened in January. I just think it's going to be more and more of the same. I don't know. What do you think? When you say Wes Streeton wants to get rid of it, do you have a vision in mind of what he would do, how he would do it if he could?
I go back to a speech which was given by Dwight D. Eisenhower. I was alive. But I wasn't paying much attention at the time, if I'm totally honest. He gave it in 1961. It was his resignation speech as US president, a Republican. Let me be clear about that. And he warned the world at that time about the threat from the industrial armaments complex to the world, and that they would always want more armaments and they would want to control government to guarantee their profit stream. And that's still by and large true, but we now have the medico-pharmaceutical complex, which is trying to do the same thing. This worries me enormously. I mean, I've done quite a number of things about Wegovy and Ozempic and things like that. I get quite worried about diabetes because I think that there is a massive over-diagnosis, or rather a failure to treat appropriately, because in most cases, the right treatment for type 2 diabetes, I mean, why type 1 and type 2 are both called diabetes when they're obviously different diseases, I don't know. But I'll leave that to the medics to sort out. But type 2, it can actually be cured, but it's never talked about. It's very rare that anybody's told you can cure this by just changing your diet, which large numbers of people can do. But it's better to actually prescribe drugs. And then, we've seen articles about, 20 months on Wegovy, and then you come off because that's the current prescription limit, I think. You'll put your weight back on. So give it another few months, and then we'll be seeing, we want to be able to do this for life. But then you're going to have to deal with all the side effects, which are muscle wasting. And then we're going to have all sorts of osteoporosis problems as a consequence. And it's bad for heart disease. It's great, by the way, for cancer, because it actually attacks glucose in the body and reduces the amount of insulin. So it does actually what, bizarrely, diabetes treatments don't do. It reduces insulin, whereas diabetes treatments increase it. I'm moving into areas which show that I'm clearly living with a medic. But there's this failure to think about it, and everything comes down to prescribe. Mm-hmm. I did have an interaction with the NHS fairly recently. I did something rather silly and had to actually talk to A&E. And they asked me, as a man aged 67, how many prescription drugs I was on. And I said, none. And they said, well, that's not possible. You can't be 67 and a man and not be on repeat prescriptions. What about your PPIs and your statins and this and that and the other? And I said, I don't have any of them. And they were completely astonished, because apparently it's quite normal to have 10 by my age, because that is the model that the pharmaceutical industry has. Mm-hmm. Dependency on long-term business models with cheap drugs like statins are the way in which they can guarantee an income stream for life. And the capture of public sector income streams for private benefit is what the model of the NHS is looking like to me. Absolutely. There is no question about how do we actually get people off drugs? How do we actually change the causes of ill health, like sugary drinks in a real way, or buns, which I've managed to break my addiction to. And I'm really pleased about that one, because I've lost 1.5 stone without doing anything other than giving up cinnamon buns. It's quite easy, actually, at the end of the day, to find out you can get better without actually requiring anything more than just giving up buns. But it is hard thing to do, and you've got to be told to do it. People are told on Wegovy and Ozempic have been told you can carry on eating buns because the drug is going to solve it. But the cost is to society. We need to actually think about these things in a very different way if the NHS is going to work well. And we've got to actually question the role of drug companies in all this, because they are the people who want the NHS to go down this line of repeat prescriptions above all else. And that scares me rigid about the future of it. But it is fundamentally capturing public money for private gain with no obvious benefits to the public at the end of the day, because there are other ways of treating a lot of these conditions. I'm not saying we don't need drugs. I'm not saying we, won't. But the interesting thing is, when you look at drug research, almost none of it at all is about cures. All of it is about managing conditions. And when you look at the most prescribed drugs, I tried to do a video on the most prescribed drugs and tied myself up in knots. So it hasn't happened yet. But I was trying to explore this thesis, and the top 10 prescribed drugs in the UK are all treatment management.
Yes.
Like PPIs or something, but nothing to do with actually solving a condition. And they're incredibly expensive.
Well, it's incredibly lucrative, like you say, isn't it? I mean, my background is a psychiatry doctor, and some of the most serious illnesses, mental illnesses, are things that you develop when you're a young person between the ages of 18 to 25. And so those drug companies make a fortune. If you, as a psychiatrist, can identify the right drug for somebody that's, they're going to be on that for years and years and years and years. And it's well known that they make a huge amount of money. It's very depressing. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, Richard, to apply that to then the system as a whole, because I think that is what's happening. We have a public service which increasingly is becoming a cash cow to these private companies who are welcoming this steady stream of public money that's coming in, and then they can skim a profit off the top. It's reliable. There's no end to it. We've got an aging population. This nonsense about bringing down waiting lists is farcical, really. When the government are going out saying we've brought the numbers down 6 months in a row. When you actually look at the numbers, it's piddling what they've achieved. Obviously.
Yeah, but they are within the normal variation of demand at the moment, the scale of the reduction that they've done.
Small. Absolutely.
It's literally that small. Yeah. Can I just explain one other sort of slightly economic theory thing about this? Because we are running towards that time when we're meant to open the questions, I guess.
Yes.
But there is sort of some economic theory here, which is about externalities. And the NHS is obviously not a microeconomic activity. It is when the individual patient is in front of you, the doctor, the nurse, whatever else you are. Of course it is. That's very micro and very particular. But as a whole, this is a macroeconomic entity. And we don't have externalities of healthcare, because the externality is our society. But it's being managed as if it is a series of microeconomic entities. And it doesn't matter that there is an externality. So we don't think about the multiplier effect I talked about, because that's an externality. So we don't count it because we don't recognize it. But we also don't recognize the externality of the harm caused by this model of perpetually handing out a drug to benefit profit, and not trying to actually really address the cause of the problem, which it doesn't appear as though our politicians have, frankly, any real interest in. When I was doing my first work on tax justice, my wife, then working as a GP, reckoned that I did more good by trying to raise money and awareness of how government spending took place than she could possibly do in the surgery, in a real sense, because I was trying to tackle poverty. And poverty is the biggest cause of ill health in the UK. And 1 in 3 children, 31% of children in the UK are now brought up in poverty. That is the biggest cause of childhood illness we have.
Yes,
it's the biggest cause of parental stress, and therefore the demand for mental health care and the demand for drugs to deal with anxiety. Not that anxiety is easy to manage, I know, with a drug, but all of those things create enormous demand. We should be tackling poverty. If we tackle poverty, and we could tackle poverty, we could redistribute wealth. It's entirely plausible. I mean, I wrote the Taxing Wealth Report, Taxing Wealth Report 2024, if you Google it. It's fairly easy to find. And I suggested I could find over £90 billion a year out of existing taxes.
Absolutely.
I didn't talk about a wealth tax. Wealth taxes are not good at raising money.
It's an excellent report, guys. If anyone's wondering who should we be taxing and how could it work, please do Google. It's the Taxing Wealth Report by Richard Murphy. It's really excellent, and it's not that long, is it, Richard?
It is. It's 126,000
There's a summary,
words.
though. There's a summary.
There is a summary.
Yeah. Read the summary.
I did realize when I finished it, it's actually one of the problems of blogging. It's actually 50 blogs joined together, which came to 126,000 words. So
it's really good. It's really interesting. And the final, so I want to ask one last question, because I think let's finish on a hopeful note. So you've touched on something, really, really fundamental there, haven't you, about poverty and the fact that if we want to improve things, we're going to have to focus on people who aren't getting enough at the moment. Do you think it's possible, Richard? We all feel quite hopeless about the state of politics, what the government are doing, cuts to funding, the economy. Could they turn this around? And if so, how?
I do know politicians who do get some of this. They are nowhere near the corridors of power. I do understand why up to a third of the population look at reform. They've realized that the system is bust. It is bust. It's completely bust. We have neoliberal politicians who hate government, trying to run government to reduce the role of government activity. And by doing so, they make the lives of people in the UK harder. That's their policy. Unsurprisingly, people aren't enamored. Could we change it? We do need to have the alternative political parties. And there are alternative political parties. The Lib Dems can be on occasions. I don't dismiss the Lib Dems. They were a neoliberal party, but there is a quite radical wing in them. The Greens seem to be waking up on economics. They've had some pretty dire economic policies, if I'm honest. I was heavily critical of their manifesto last year. They have taken note, actually. I've engaged with them on it.
That's good.
The SNP are sort of, the membership are incredibly radical and really good. The leadership, not quite so much. In Wales, we've got Plaid Cymru, and Plaid Cymru is doing very well. We have these areas of hope.
Yes.
Do we have the opportunity for a new party? I don't know. Do we need proportional representation? Yes. The thing that actually gives me most hope is that at some point, lots of Labour MPs, half of them at least, are going to realise they're going to lose their seats. And they're going to say, we want PR. Now, PR will result in more reform seats. Yeah, I want there to be more reform seats because I want to show what the bastards are like. Sorry, but I don't like them very much. And I actually want them exposed for who they are. They would privatise health. That is Nigel Farage's model. He said he wants an insurance-based model. And all of those people voting for it are going to be really shocked to discover that, just as the red states in America, the Republican states, are just discovering that they're going to lose Medicaid in vast numbers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they are going to be totally shocked by it. So we need to have these models to make it clear to people that we actually need to talk about progressive alternatives. And I believe that's what I'm trying to create. I am writing a new book. I don't know how I've got time to do it. I will do it. Writing books is an agonizing process. You've done it, Ju. But I'm going to have a go at doing another one. They've sold quite well in the past. The same publisher as Gary Stevenson has got, to be honest, and he's done very well. So I think they want me as another YouTuber to repeat their success with Gary's book. Gary and I think we should be doing some work together. We probably will. We need to create platforms of coherence around the alternatives. That's what the aim is for my work.
Absolutely. Well, we're really excited about your book. I knew you were doing it already, and I'm sure that lots of people here, Richard, are really excited to hear that you're going to be writing.
The working title is The Politics of Care. That may not be the M1. The Politics of Care, a Cure for Populism is what it's called at present.
It's really exciting, and I can't wait to read it. And thank you ever so much. Let's move on to the Q&A. I haven't actually had any look in this chat box of what people have been saying. So if anyone now would like to ask Richard something, please.
I don't want to be Prime Minister to the person who's just nominated me for the role.
Okay. Right. Some of these might be comments. So let me just check. Okay. That's a comment from Stephen. Okay, Timothy Bartell, Dr. Timothy Bartell, is that the one that you answered earlier, Richard? Occasional contributor to your blog, so I know you've answered this question a number of times, but for tonight's audience...
I sort of answered Timothy's question, I tried to. Hope so, Timothy.
Okay. And then this is a comment, I think, from Mervyn.
That's about the Bank of England, and it's absolutely correct. That is a report published by UCL. I know the authors... and we persuaded the Bank of England that this is true, by the way. The Bank of England agree that they make the money. Alex Scott Samuel has his hand up, I can see.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with what Mervyn said earlier, but one thing I would say is that those of us who understand modern monetary so-called theory have failed miserably to get politicians and policymakers to acknowledge the facts about money creation. Could I ask Richard whether you'd be willing to write a brief parliamentary briefing that gives the facts in very, very simple language and send it to every single MP and peer?
The difficulty with that, and I will be honest with you, of course I could write it. That's not a difficulty. It's really pretty straightforward, and it's an acknowledged fact in the sense that the Bank of England agrees with it, the Bank of Canada does, the German Central Bank, the European Central Bank. Yeah, everybody agrees that this is right. Except politicians say that the moment they say that, they'll be treated as lunatics and they'll be told that there is a magic money tree and therefore they're utterly recklessly irresponsible. But it's not just the politicians. I did create some tax justice organisations, including the Fair Tax Mart, the Tax Justice Network, Tax Justice UK. I'm not now involved with any of them. And one of the reasons why is that they all insist that tax pays for government services, and it doesn't. And when I took that up with the chief executive of one of those organisations and say, why won't you acknowledge what you know, which is that tax actually controls inflation and can be used for other social purposes like redistribution of income and wealth, but that's a secondary part of the sort of inflation control policy, an important one. Why won't you acknowledge this? He said, the moment I say that tax doesn't pay for nurses, I won't get any funding for a tax campaign ever again. That people won't be interested. That will be the end of it. So my well-being depends on promoting the untruth. And that's the problem with our politicians. They believe that if they tell the public that actually every pound in their pocket was simply created out of thin air, people won't believe the pound has any value anymore. There will be an automatic run on the pound, a collapse whatsoever. When I persuaded Jeremy Corbyn to basically say this in 2015, David Cameron mocked me. It was quite funny, really. David Cameron got Worst Political Joke of the Year award from somebody for actually making a joke about me in my book, The Joy of Tax. He claimed he'd taken it home and tried it out with Samantha and none of the positions worked, which really was a very tacky joke he made at Conservative Party conference. But I was the butt of it, because he wouldn't believe this story. And that was what the story of the book was. So we have this massive impediment that politicians believe that we would literally destroy the value of the pound because people have to believe that their money in the bank is backed up by a little pile of notes, which are sitting on a shelf there with their name on it. There is nothing behind your bank statement. The only record that there is money in the bank is the number printed on your computer screen. And it is a debt owing by the bank to you, which they could default on. And the possibility that that is true is something that no politician wants to acknowledge. And that's the difficulty with this. Truth is very hard for politicians to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. Okay. We've got a comment in here. Oh, sorry, it's a question from Jenny. This article from The Guardian was published in 2016. I've read this article before, Jenny, about how apparently we don't have an NHS anymore. It was to do with the Lansley reforms.
This is the post 2012. Yeah.
Yes.
And I campaigned heavily against the 2012 reforms. I actually got fourth most active social media campaigner against it, which was really quite strange, given it was my secondary activity. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I've jumped in.
It was something, I remember seeing this article, and I don't have time right now to look for it, Jenny, but I think this article itself was debunked by Full Fact, and I found it confusing myself. We were talking about this amongst our team earlier on today, about this idea that we don't have an NHS anymore. It's been completely got rid of through policy changes. And in a way, I understand where people are coming from, because the model has changed so much and there is a lot of privatisation and there are lots of mechanisms to make people wealthy, shareholders, etc. within the NHS. My concern with saying something like we no longer have an NHS because of the policies that have changed is that if you deliver that line to the public, then it confuses them.
The reason why that argument was put forward, can I explain why I think that argument was put? It might have even been Section 1 of the 2012 Act basically said the Secretary of State for Health is not responsible for supplying services anymore.
Yes.
They have no personal responsibility for what happens in the NHS, which is how we ended up with NHS England, NHS Scotland, NHS Wales, and the equivalent in Northern Ireland. Is it called NHS Northern Ireland, or has it got another name?
No, it's called the HSC.
That's right. I knew I was something. Anyway, so there were these basically devolved authorities, which is literally how NHS England came into play. And the Department of Health was downplayed, which is now being reversed. But this was a game. Look through the games. It's not just follow the money, it's follow the power. There was no health secretary ever since who could actually use this to deny responsibility. Jeremy Hunt failed in the end. I mean, he was a dismal failure as a health secretary, but he also failed to deny responsibility when it came to COVID. Who was responsible for there not being stocks of PPE? Jeremy Hunt had not acted on the simulations and models. He was responsible. It was politically, it clearly sort of landed at his door, as did other failures during that process on Matt Hancock's door. Even though legally they weren't responsible, the law said they weren't. So we have to look through the shams, the charades, the games that politicians play. Legally, the Bank of England is independent of the government. Absolutely no governor of the Bank of England has ever thought that's been the case since 1998, because they have a quiet word with the Chancellor and at the end of the day do what the Chancellor really wants, unless it's Rachel Reeves and our current Andrew Bailey, and when it's the other way around because she once worked for him in the bank, and she hasn't got over it. But follow the power chains, don't follow the law. So although this is what the law said, the relationship of power remained that it's absolutely sitting with the Secretary of State for Health. But those are devolved in Wales and Scotland, and quite successfully devolved in those countries. And you have to remind yourself that they really are independent authorities in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. There are some excellent comments in here, but I'm going to pick one last question to ask you, Richard, if that's okay. It's about foundation trusts. Let me find it, because I think it's an interesting question. Okay, question for Richard from Judith. How do foundation trusts affect the NHS? As I understand it, they work partly as private businesses. Would we be better off without them?
Well, the whole problem of the foundation trusts is actually what is their legal basis for a start. What are they? Are they limited liability entities? Are they proper structures? Are they trusts? How do they account? Who are they accountable to? What is their governance structure? If they have a surplus, who owns that surplus or deficit? There is a deep confusion because there wasn't proper legislation to create these things in the first place, fundamentally. And that's why I think the model is fundamentally flawed. It was, of course, meant to consolidate a whole pile of other trusts. It hasn't succeeded in doing that very well. The intention was very clearly to try to copy a private sector model, as I've already explained, though, in a way which no private sector organization would do. Private sector organizations do not give up control and try to pretend they have no control over their subsidiaries. They actually keep a very strong control over their subsidiaries to make sure they're doing exactly what is required of them. So these don't fit a private sector model. So what are they if they are not created for the opportunity of contracting out of services and control, as you say, to insurance-based models? I'm not sure. I do hope they are demolished because, frankly, at the moment, they look like the basis for a reform health policy, which would be very much based around some NHS provision, but definitely with a top-up of insurance, with that insurance top-up becoming more and more important, with, frankly, a private sector model becoming dominant, I believe. And why the predominant support of reform thinks that a private sector model would be good for them, I really don't know.
Well, it's quite
they're persuaded. I mean, but when you point out any of the policies that reform is doing, I must say, I did actually do a blog this morning pointing out the reform wants to close down all the green energy policies in the area for which they're responsible. Well, green energy costs 1/3 of the price of gas and nuclear and other energy sources, but they want to close down the cheap source and maintain the expensive source. And that's all, again, about providing basically government revenue streams for private gain. And these things did look like that. And I still think they have a horrible feel like that. And I think they're staffed in that way, with people who believe in the model. That, again, is very scary. But you have to remember that it is now over 40 years that the neoliberal way of thinking has been the predominant way in which economics and indeed accounting is taught inside universities. I've just written with two others, or edited, but actually in my case wrote about 9 of the 22 chapters, a new accounting textbook, which is based upon an anti-neoliberal model of accounting, where we actually don't think it is entirely about large companies capturing the world for profit. We even talk about there being a state, and state organizations need to account and who for, and stakeholders and everything else. That is radical because nobody's tried to do it. Now, isn't that extraordinary?
Absolutely.
Accounting education in the UK has never recognised that the state has to prepare accounts, or charities, or small businesses, or NGOs, or anybody else. They've never done it. And we've written a book which recognises that. And this is sort of the way in which I'm trying to creep against this model, because everybody's taught the only solution is Privatise everything. That's it.
Is
92% of economists in universities are reckoned to be conventional neoliberal. There are only 8% heterodox, and most of them aren't in economics departments. So I was in an accounting department, but really doing political economy. Extraordinary.
There's some about the trusts, or the way those foundation trusts have been set up. This government are also saying that they want to get rid of inequality in the country, and they're on the other hand saying they're going to get rid of the failing managers and they're going to cut this and cut that. And if the trust can't prove that they're doing a job, then they're blah blah blah. And it's just this sort of punitive top down. We're going to do to you because you haven't done well enough for your local population. If you look at the foundation trusts that are the ones that are failing, it's often because they've got some rubbish building that was put up, as part of a private
PFI.
Yeah, or they have a particularly vulnerable population for one reason.
Isn't it amazing? Inner city areas have high demand and no numbers of GPs. Leafy Oxfordshire, sorry to say this if you're in Oxfordshire tonight, but by and large, you'll be overpopulated proportionally with GPs and in better premises. It's just the way it is. I mean, this is the way power structures work. And until we actually teach that and explain to people, there are very few political economy degrees, though, in the UK. And that's really scary too. So we don't teach about how to deal with this thinking in a way that we need to. And that's where I still think I've got a lot of work to do. And that's why I do a YouTube channel. The more people who watch it, the easier it is to get the message out there. And I'm
that's
working
the perfect
around
way
the
to sum up.
Sorry?
It's the perfect way to sum up. I mean, we've got to draw this to a close because I think I've taken enough of Richard's time, and I really, really appreciate it, Richard. Before we go, can I encourage everybody to sign up to Richard's blog and follow him on YouTube and whatever social media platform you're on, because
Blue Sky is my main other Twitter replacement.
Fabulous. Yeah. Fabulous. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Someone said something very positive. It's been great, Richard. You're great. We really, really appreciate you coming. And for anyone who's here who would like to support Every Doctor as well, there are links in the chat to our crowdfunder and to our shop because we've just launched some new merchandise and it's disappearing fast. So we really, really
I read this evening's newsletter.
Well, how did you do that in the time that you had available?
And I smiled at the shout out to me in the newsletter. I thought that was very amusing.
Yeah.
Well, of course, I read your newsletter tonight.
That's what I do in my spare time, guys. I write a newsletter. So, So thank you, Richard. We really, really appreciate you joining us. And we hope to have you back when you have your book out or sooner. But thank you. We really, really appreciate everything that you do. And
thank you very much.
Everybody. Hope everybody has a good evening. Take care. Speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.